Good morning, guys. Welcome to another episode of The Unlikely Journey. I'm here with Natalise Kalea Robinson, Jess Furman, and of course, this is Khuong. This morning, we're going to talk about critical feedback. We get it all the time. We get it from investors. We get it from our employees. We get it from friends. How do we deal with critical feedback? So I'm going to start this off by asking Jess and Natalise. Both of you guys are founders of companies. And, you're constantly pitching your ideas. You're pitching your ideas to get investment. You're pitching your ideas for a marketing campaign. And you get feedback from a lot of different people, including investors. And sometimes they're conflicting. How do you consume, digest conflicting feedback, and what do you do with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's interesting. Like, I actually really welcome uh, feedback of any sense because a lot of what I do is pitching all the time into what feels like a giant void. So anytime that someone is able to give me some sort of constructive element back as to why something didn't work, it really just aids in my ability to adjust either like my team's process or whatever we delivered in terms of like creative for the client. So yeah, I guess any in my world, usually we don't get constructive feedback. We just hear crickets. So, so I actually really appreciate when someone takes the time to say, "Hey, I don't think this worked for these reasons."
Do you think that's more specific to the industries that you're in? That sounds like an anomaly to me. Most of the time, in my experiences, you can't get people to shut up. Everybody wants to be an expert. Everybody has an opinion. And what you just said there, it's a bit shocking to me. Do you think it's like industry related?
I guess it is like from a pitching perspective. Like if I'm honest, like if we're on a project with a team and there's a team of people who everyone's voice needs to be heard on the client side, and there's conflicting feedback, that makes it a little bit tricky. But I guess also like if we're being hired to do something, it's not and maybe it is that it's an entertainment. It's not. It's you kind of have to take your ego out of it, and just think constructively. And I always take the approach where at some point this is their project if they've hired me to do it. So I have to just take into consideration what they have, and I have to balance that with what they have to say and what their interests are. But I also have to balance that with my expertise, because if they hired me for a specific expertise or they're coming to me for that expertise, I have to gauge what they're asking for, and ultimately understand that yes, I have to go with what they say to a degree, but I also have to stand firm in the expertise that they hired me to provide. And that would be the times where I push back on critical feedback.
Now, at least you're raising. As a founder, we never stop raising. So
Yeah.
you engage with investors all the time. And I'm sure
Yeah.
there are some that will tell you something that sticks on one end of the spectrum, and there are some that are way on the other side of the spectrum. How do you deal with the diverse set of thoughts and ideas that are coming at you all the time?
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm going through it right now. You're right. And I don't have a like one good answer. I think what I've learned to recognize is that people come to the table with obviously their own thoughts and experiences, though, so their perspectives are shaped by the other portfolio companies that they've invested in. And things that they've seen in the market, and so and they sometimes these investors sit on different ends of the spectrum and in different industries. And so I think like Jess, when someone gives feedback, I definitely listen to it, and I definitely try to take it to heart, and see, to explore that. All at the same time, I try not to be like a leaf in the wind, because I think that there's nothing more frustrating for internal, like it's like if I went back to my co-founder and said, hey, this investor said this, so we should like change and do this, and then like next week another investor says something else, and hey, we should change and do this, like he would be so frustrated with me, right? And I think so I found that it's sort of my job now to sort of take all feedback, but then really synthesize it, and then come to my co-founder with a more thoughtful approach. And that's, but it is a not a project to manage, but it is a thought process that I have to manage, if that makes sense.
For sure. So that leads me to the next question. All of us as entrepreneurs, we have to have a very strong filtering system. So, how do you know what to let in and how do you know what to keep out? Because again, there are no shortages of ideas, advice, and opinions coming from all sorts of people.
I mean, I'll take this one. I think you just have to kind of gauge it from where it comes, right? Like I know I'm working on a new tech project, and I I've been kind of beta testing my ideas against like a wide variety of people, ranging from, I had a dinner last night, someone who's been in the industry, for all the Web 1, Web 2 stuff. And, his perspective on Web 3 is fascinating. He's had tech companies that have taken advantage of all these different evolutions of this technology, I might take it, with a grain of salt, his perspective. I try to get a wide range and then take a step back. And, ultimately, if you are a founder, it's because you believe in the thing that you're working on. So, I just try to like take my emotionality out of it and just gather as many wide perspectives as I can. And then, pull it all together and make a decision. I mean, I'll even call, my parents or someone that isn't really involved in, like, say, the tech sphere for what I'm working on right now, because I want to hear, if they're going to be on the consumer side potentially, like, what are their thoughts on it? Like, where is it not landing for them? So, I mean, I think ultimately at the end of the day, like, I love to gather personally a wide range of perspectives, and then I filter it and distill it down to where it comes from based on the experience, and also like where my vision is and what I trust my instincts, to be from my experience. What about you, Steve?
Well, I encounter this every day. I speak to investors almost on a daily basis, and I speak to our executive team almost on a hourly basis. It's probably too much. And I speak to our employees as well. And then I speak to people that are outside of my business and they'll ask questions, and when I give them an answer, they'll come back with their opinion. So this happens to me a lot. And the way that I deal with it is I ask myself a couple of questions before I let any of their ideas infiltrate my mindset. So the first question that I'm going to ask is, well, this person has an idea, this person has opinion. What is potentially the intention of their feedback? So if they're an investor per se, well, the intention is that if they're going to have a relationship with me, they want me to have an outcome so that they can benefit from that relationship. So that's a monetary thing for the most part. Of course, I don't want to generalize. There are some investors that would invest in a mission as well. But I think that's far and few in between. Most investors are investing because they want a multiple on their money. On the other end of that, if you're an employee at the company and you're going to give me feedback, I'm going to ask the same question. So, like, what is the intention of the feedback? Most likely, the intention is so that we can provide them a better working experience, a better path to growth, potentially more compensation. But those things are related. So, when I think about intention, I have to take all that with a grain of salt. Is their intention, does that align with the outcome that I want? Does it benefit me? Does it benefit the company? So if I can recognize early on, someone's feedback is so skewed only to look after their own personal outcomes and the results that they want without creating a mutual reciprocal impact for me, then I would likely just filter it out, and just say, great, this person is speaking on a lot of confirmation bias because of their situation and what they want out of this conversation. If I determine that this individual or this group of people are giving feedback based on a mutually beneficial outcome, then I'll let that come into play and I'll then start asking the second level of questions. Then it becomes, well, is this person an expert in this field? And when I say expert, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be an entrepreneurial expert. It could be an employee that is an expert in a function. And then from there, I'll ask the last question, which is, if I am going to take what you say as important, what am I going to do with it? Am I just going to like sit with it, write it on a piece of paper and just let it marinate in my journal? Or am I actually going to convert this into an action item? And I have to make that decision pretty fast, because if the answer is the latter, then I have to execute on that and make sure that I give myself a timeline for goals and outcomes. So that's how I generally take feedback. So it's either going to be you're locked out on level 1 filter, or if you get through level 3 filter, I do something with it. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's I mean, it's very methodical for sure. Um, it's very disciplined actually. Um, I'm trying to think through right now if this is something I sort of do like unconsciously and don't think about, or it's like what, but I can how I can kind of integrate like this process like more consciously, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Totally. I bet you do it. I bet both you and Jess do this subconsciously.
Yeah.
Because look, at the end of the day, time isn't necessarily our friend. We don't get more time, right? We're always running out of time. And
Mm,
your time is extremely valuable. If you're a founder, an executive CEO, your hourly rate is likely thousands of dollars an hour, right? We don't typically think in that way, but it is. It's like thousands of dollars an hour. And if you're going to be just talking to a bunch of individuals who are potentially going to benefit you or your company, you better make sure you do one of two things pretty fast. Determine that it was kind of like not worth your time and then call it sunk costs, or you do something with it pretty quickly. You know what I mean?
yeah. Yeah.
So this leads me to the next question. As you all are thinking about what I just said, I want you to imagine like your thought process. How much of your thought process post conversation with these feedback givers, how much of that process is going to be given precedence towards the data side versus the gut instinct intuition side?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, so I've just been quiet 'cause I've been thinking about like what you said. Like, it is a very like you seem to have a very like clear, methodical process towards it. And I think you're right. I think, and this is what comes down to like the maybe the intuition versus the data. Because if I really think about my process, like you're right. It is fairly methodical. Maybe at points where I think it's gut and intuition kind of is a little bit more. It is based for me, at least at this stage in my career. Like I mean, coming from the artist side, I had to do a lot of work and take a lot of business classes and conflict resolution classes to just understand feedback and people's roles and working in teams in a different capacity than I was confronted with when I was just doing like the solo artist or this studio world thing on the creative side. Um, and it's interesting to like have this conversation because I do think at this point, like I've managed to just take the emotionality out of it, and that always wasn't always. I would react. I would be. I wouldn't. I'd have trouble distinguishing between the feedback and taking it personally, and that hasn't been the case for me for very many years. So I would say for me, like I just gather everything. It's the data. I look at the data, and then I do make a gut intuition decision, but it is heavily based on me pulling a bunch of different opinions and then kind of just sitting down and having all those ideas written down everywhere, and then pulling it all together, which again, for me does come down to gut and intuition, but it is rooted in data and gathering information for me. Natalise, I mean, you were an artist as well, like back in the day, so how do you feel about this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's funny because it's like I think as an artist, like coming from that perspective, like emotion is really important, right? Like some of the greatest songs and some of the greatest like work would not have happened without that magic of like emotion, right? So we value emotion really. We put that on a pedestal. But I think like what you're just talking about right now is like is the order, right? Like you gather a lot of data, and then at the end, you still have to make a decision, right? Like, and that decision isn't always from data, right? Because you know the joke about consultants is like it's like uh, paralysis by analysis, right? Like you'll never make a decision because you can basically, like, for lack of a better phrase, like shit on everything, like and every detail where you just talk yourself out of it. But so I think you gather all the data, and then at the end, you still have to make a decision with conviction. Um, and there is an emotional component around that because you have to believe that it's worth it, and that's an emotional decision. So I think that is the right, combination of sorts.
You guys are onto something for sure. I can't help but think about a book that I just read recently. It's a fascinating book. It was written by a very successful entrepreneur by the name of Dave Liu, and it's called The Way of the Wall Street Warrior. And I hope I don't do him disservice by trying to summarize some of the core themes here. But basically, this is a book about understanding the corporate game, be it if you're raising money or if you're working on Wall Street. We tend to think that people make decisions based on logic and data. That's what we're taught to believe. I never went to business school. Not at least you went to business school. I'm sure my assumption is that a lot of what you might have been taught is like, look at this modeling, look at this spreadsheet. What does the data tell you? Well, Dave Liu outright said that whether you like it or not, human beings are irrational, and decisions are mostly being made on an irrational basis. Yes, we tend to think that we'll let in a lot of data, but at the very end of that decision tree is an emotional reaction. Ultimately, do I want to do this? Or like, I don't know, I don't like the way that this person sounded on the phone, or maybe I just didn't like the way he smelled. There's
Yeah.
you can't eliminate that from the decision making.
Well, at the end of the day, it's like a leap of faith, right? Like you have to take that leap of faith somewhere, like on the journey. And it's like, are you willing to take that risk?
Yeah, absolutely. Which then leads me to the next question. We get feedback about business plans, we get feedback about company strategy, and then every once in a while we get the kind of feedback that we don't like to hear about, which is personal feedback. Well, Steve, you could have done this better. Or like, Jess, I didn't like the way that you approached the conversation in the boardroom. How do you guys take personal feedback? I mean, it's not like sometimes it's just not the first thing I want to hear in the morning. You know what I mean? But I'm curious.
Yeah.
I mean, I think again, it depends on who it's coming from. Like, is it coming from a friend who's in a cranky mood or a coworker who had a bad morning, and is kind of just annoyed in general, or is it actually someone constructively trying to tell me you spoke too fast in this meeting, or I think you overreached. I appreciate feedback. I appreciate feedback. I mean, otherwise I'm operating in a vacuum. I'd rather have someone tell me I have spinach on my front teeth than not, and amplify that to maybe a quality or a trait that doesn't serve me in a meeting or in a deal that I'm doing. But again, I take it from where it comes, right? I take it from, if does it seem to be constructive, or even if maybe it is something a little bit mean spirited, is there a little truth in it? But again, I love feedback. I mean, I think this is the musician in me. I didn't get better by people telling me I was good. I got better by people telling me what I was doing wrong. So I really actually appreciate, like I said, constructive criticism on all levels.
How do you guys respond when you get sort of like a red alert feedback, which is just like, by the way that you approached it was all bad, and all and like an alarming type of feedback. All these people had, well, maybe it doesn't happen to you guys because you guys are so lovely, but it certainly has happened to me.
I lock myself in my room and cry. No.
That's probably the knee-jerk instinct, right? It's like inside you like cower in this little room.
Yeah, exactly. In my heart, I die a little bit. No, I think so I think the funny thing is that like growing up in an Asian household specifically, I think like there was like critical feedback all the time on everything.
Everything,
On everything.
everything. You're never
So
good enough. You bring
yeah,
home
yeah, yeah,
the 4.0, or why wasn't it 4.1? You get a master's. Well, when are you going to go get your doctorate? You
yeah,
get your MBA. Well, we need the law degree as well.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, so you know, when Jess, when you say like you love feedback, like my knee jerk reaction is I'm cool with feedback. Like because the thing is like I take feedback really seriously, like personal feedback actually. And I think that's good and bad. I take it to heart for sure because let's be honest. Most of the time, feedback is not delivered in a way that it probably could be delivered, and so you kind of have to sift out like that delivery with like the actual message. And so I think you know when I hear like red alert feedback it takes time for me to process it, but I do process it. And I think I'm very attuned to change. But there are times when I'm like, I see other people in my life who I love, but who they're my husband, for example. He is much more um, he's open to feedback, but he's very confident in kind of like who he is. He like kind of stands his ground. Um, and so he's not as flustered when feedback comes. And there's something that I admire about that. And sometimes I think, well, maybe like I should move towards that spectrum in my confidence, but then I wouldn't be as open necessarily to and 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 take action on that change. So I go back and forth.
Yeah, that's interesting, Natalise, because you're right. It is like if you do take it to heart, then are you considering the feedback more seriously versus someone who is confident and brushes it off, or potentially could brush it off by not being so, like by not taking it at that deep of a level. I know. For me, I just get curious, and this is like years of therapy and years of like I did take a bunch of conflict resolution classes because I would get mortally wounded by certain feedback. So I don't know. At this point, I just get curious. If it's a DEF CON, if it's gotten to a point where it's a DEF CON, I just get curious because it's not just that one moment that has gotten messed up. But if it is a red alert, I have been ignoring things leading up to that red alert. And I want to know about it. So I try to get curious before I hang myself on a cross over it. And that helps me. I just sit back and I just say, what did I miss here? I missed something, especially if it's a massive thing. I missed something. But then I also like meditate on the idea that there are no real big deals, right? Like if I mess up, there's not someone lying on an operating table and I've just cut the wrong, ventricle in their heart. Like I always think about those stakes in different scenarios. And I just take a deep breath and just try to get curious, and reserve judgment until I've kind of, had a chance to talk and figure out maybe where I went wrong.
Well, here's some feedback for you guys. We're almost out of time. And I'm going to just close out by saying, I really appreciate the both of you guys. Man, you guys are so different and just so lovely. I'm so blessed to have both of you guys in my life. How's that for feedback this morning?
That's wonderful. Thank you.
All right, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, signing out this morning for the Unlikely Journey, this is Stephen Khuong, Natalise Kalea Robinson, and Jess Furman. We'll see you guys next time. And of course, peace.